Good. Yes, Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, in the allocation of time for closing arguments, the court has allowed both sides an hour and a half. The defense's argument will be continuous. For that reason, we'll take about a 10-minute recess at this time, complete theirs, and then we'll complete the state's. We'll take them out for a minute. Gentlemen of the jury, please prepare. Court will be in recess 10 minutes.
Please remain seated till the judge is out of the courtroom. Court will be in recess for 10 minutes. Remain seated or step outside. Now, there'll be no milling around in the courtroom. You either go outside or stay seated. Please remain seated or go out in the hall. It's milling around. Okay.
Crime scene. Second day, they showed you multiple photographs of the beds of the victims and the blood that was found on the bed sheets. On the third day, they introduced piles of bed sheets and pillows and nightclothes and pillowcases. And their serology testimony to show what was completely obvious, what no one would have thought to question from the first day, which was that the blood of the victims was the blood that was found on the beds where they were lying when they were beaten. But suggest to you that the only reason that the state presented all of this cumulative and horrible evidence of the blood at the crime scene and all of these tangible items of evidence was to prejudice you and to cloud your emotions to your assessment of the scant evidence concerning Mr. Bundy that would follow. Consider what it was that the police forgot to do, what they overlooked. There was testimony concerning a Clairol bottle found in Lisa Levy's room, which seemed to appear to be a valuable piece of evidence. Somebody said it had some hair elements on it, had some blood on it. It might have been used as an object by the perpetrator of these crimes, and any fingerprint evidence on this item was also lost. It was kicked around on the floor for 5 days. It was not collected, and it was not properly preserved. They show you a picture of a woodpile out back. They take no cast prints from around the woodpile. They gave you no photographs of the foyer. only a description from one of the witnesses that this was a bright wallpaper. I ask you to look at the pictures that we've introduced into evidence, and you'll see that's not bright wallpaper. That is dull and dim, dark blue. A very dark room. Also, consider the evidence of the pantyhose mask from Dunwoody that was spread on the floor, that was later swept, and you saw Ms. Lasko bring in all of those piles of hairs that were swept from the floor. There's no way that the state's circumstantial evidence of hairs on a mask shows you beyond a reasonable doubt that those hairs had to have been left by the person that left the mask. It's equally consistent with the interpretation that those hairs adhered to the mask when it was placed on the floor for purposes of photography. No officer noted what lights were on in the foyer that night. No officers tested the lights, the decibel of the lights, how the lights would reflect in that dark first room of the foyer. Nancy Dowdy did testify that when she went downstairs with Nita Neary that the light was subdued and that it was dim. It would be an important consideration for you to evaluate this evidence, to know exactly what the lights were, but they forgot to find that evidence. They forgot to preserve it for you to know about. Another important piece of evidence that Officer Brannon discussed was in Margaret Bowman's room. He saw a pantyhose wrapper in the trash can. No one collected that evidence. No one attempted to take any fingerprints from that after Mr. Bundy was arrested. There were numerous unidentified latent fingerprints found at both the Dunwoody scene and the Kayamega house. There were about 260 persons that were placed on the officers' elimination list. Elimination lists were names of all those people that had some sort of access, lawful access to the premises, so that they could eliminate whether or not their fingerprints made the questioned fingerprints that the police were trying to identify with the assailant. All of the police officers, all of the residents, all of the known guests, all of the medical personnel, all of the waiters and the known house employees were placed on that elimination list. 260 persons. But those fingerprints remain unidentified. Now, before Mr. Bundy was arrested, they submitted to the crime lab names of 102 suspects in this case. But after Mr. Bundy was arrested, they only submitted the fingerprints of 4 individuals. They stopped looking. They stopped trying to find out who left those latent fingerprints at the Kayamega house. And instead, they want to imply that somehow the assailant was wearing gloves. But there are pieces of evidence in this case that indicate to you clearly that that is not the case. That the assailant was not wearing gloves. First of all, the evidence technicians testified that they found no glove smears or fabric prints at the scene. Also, one of the very first people in Margaret Bowman's room found a bloody fingerprint on the edge of the door. Margaret Bowman didn't make that fingerprint. She didn't get up out of that bed after she was hit. But the evidence technician, the comparison man that came from the lab later, he looked at that bloody fingerprint and said that it had ridge detail, meaning the pattern of the ridges that are left by your fingers when you touch a surface, but insufficient detail for comparison purposes. That indicates that the assailant was not wearing gloves, and he left that ridge detail there on the door. And even though they can't identify that one print, they should still have kept looking to see if they couldn't identify all those other prints that they found, that they couldn't identify with any of their 260 elimination personalities. Furthermore, Nita Neary, who was looking at the man's hands more than anything else, said the man at the door wasn't wearing gloves. Said she was absolutely sure the man wasn't wearing gloves. And yet, there are places where the assailant would have had to pass through where there are numerous fingerprints that remain unidentified. Room 8, Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner's room, there were 11 points around the door jamb that were unidentified. There was one print in Margaret Bowman's room, and there were 2 prints at what they think, or what they want to call the point of entry, that remain unidentified.